Good evening and Happy New Year. I'm Richard Clay, the President and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture. Our speaker, Dennis Medley, is a historical reenactor and researcher who is currently focused on the Kentucky frontier period with an emphasis on frontier surveying. He's a founder of Fincastle County Surveyors, an 18th century reenacting group, currently supporting historical events in the eastern United States. In the modern period, so to speak, Dennis is the CEO of PMC Regional Hospital, located in New Albany. He grew up in Valley Station. He went to University of Louisville, majored in business, lives out in Prospect. His office in New Albany is located on Grant Line Road, which is the western boundary of the land grant surveyed by General George Rodgers Clark for his former regiments. So please join me in welcoming Dennis Medley.
Evening. You all ready to take a trip down the Ohio River tonight? We're going to need more canoes. Good crowd here. What we're going to cover is, as the title indicates, the survey expedition in 1773. This was the first official survey into Kentucky from Virginia. And we're going to cover different aspects of it to try to give you a kind of a big picture and a detailed picture of what was involved, what led up to the initial settlement efforts into Kentucky, what were the challenges, and what it was like for the men that took on such a bold expedition like this. So the source material on this expedition, actually there's quite a bit, given how early this was. There's a journal from Isaac Height that's available in Dale Payne's book, Narratives of Pioneer Life and Border Warfare. So Isaac Height was on the expedition. The journals by both James and Robert McAfee, they're also available in Dale Payne's book. Thomas Walker Bullitt's manuscript titled My Life at Oxmoor. He has excerpts in there covering the expedition of Thomas Bullitt. And then there's numerous letters and filings and such as Life and Times of Robert McAfee and his family written by himself, which is available. So there's quite a bit of documentation, which helps us put together the picture of what this involved. A little background, though. Does anyone know what a charter is, the English charter? Probably heard of it, the term, but what is it really? I would have initially thought it's just an official government document proclaiming this or that, and it's not. It's not a proclamation. It's actually a business contract between entrepreneurs and the government, the English government. So if you wanted to start a new colony, whether it be in North America or somewhere else on the planet back at that time, and you could put together the investors and financiers for it and men to lead it, you could create a new colony basically under a charter with the king. What the crown got out of it was a percentage of profits that the colony generated, but they didn't put up any money. So they got the benefits without taking any risk. The risks were totally up to the entrepreneurs that were financing the expedition or the settlement. So what's interesting about the Virginia Charter, 1609, is that they claimed from the coast all the way to the Pacific Ocean and then north up to the Great Lakes. So you can see the outline of what Virginia claimed. So they had some very big ambitions for Virginia. What differed with the other English colonies is they only claimed land westward to the Appalachian Mountains. So they left all that territory behind open for Virginia to claim when they filed their charter. Their original charter for Virginia was 1607. 2 years earlier, and it only claimed narrow stretches along the coast. So when they came back 2 years later, resubmitted, got it approved, they thought they were going to go all the way to the Pacific one day. There's a lot of important Indian treaties that impacted the settlement in Kentucky, and let's run through those real quick. Proclamation of 1763, that was at the conclusion of the French and Indian War. A couple of important things that came out of that is that the king recognized the native rights, and by doing so, he basically was trying to establish sovereignty over the native nations, particularly those in the Ohio Valley. The line basically followed the Appalachian Ridge from Massachusetts all the way down to Spanish Florida. Later, then, the Treaty of Hard Labor, 1763, the Cherokees relinquished territory in part of what is current day West Virginia. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix, 1768, the Iroquois Federation, or also known as the Six Nations, they basically released land to Virginia or the colonies for everything south of the Ohio River down to the Tennessee River. Problem with that was you had numerous tribes living in the Ohio Valley under previous agreements and arrangements with the Six Nations or Iroquois Federation. And they had a little problem with that because they used Kentucky as their hunting lands and shared that with the Southern tribes. The Treaty of Lochaber, 1770, redraws the Treaty of Hard Labor for the Cherokee. And that's also known as the Donaldson Line. There's Donaldson Line markers on some of the highways that overlap that. And we'll continue on to maps in a moment to give you a visual of what these treaty lines involve. Then you got the Treaty of Camp Charlotte, 1774, which ended Lord Dunmore's war. And the Shawnee relinquished some rights to Kentucky. I can't find where it's really clear what rights they relinquished. They basically said, we won't attack whites coming down the river in canoes anymore, but they didn't say you could live there. The understanding from Lord Dunmore was we can send people to settle there and survey. Then the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, 1775, Colonel Richard Henderson, another prominent Virginian, decided to sell Kentucky, or purchase Kentucky, I'm sorry, from the Cherokee. And the Cherokee decided, based on what he was offering, that was okay, we'll sell it. So again, the Shawnee had a little issue with that. They basically had their Kentucky sold out from under them twice by other Indian nations. So this gives you a quick visual of the Appalachian line. You can see the red line there is all the way down to Spanish Florida, is what the proclamation under the king established. So that's about as official as you can get right there. Then you have the more dubious lines, which were later agreed to with various Indian nations. In the red there is the Treaty of Hard Labor, and the yellow is the Lochaber Treaty that moved that line westward. The reason they moved that line is because they found whites living on the wrong side and Indians living on the wrong side. So they said, well, we got to try to fix this. And that resulted in the Lochaber agreement. Then the boundary accepted through the unofficial negotiations after the Treaty of Lochaber basically gave up. They were kind of shooting for the Kentucky River all the way to the Ohio River. Looks like it almost dissects Lexington there. But it's not even clear what the payment was for that purchase. But a big half of Kentucky, what today is Kentucky, was given up at that time. Again, under dubious circumstances. This map is interesting because this was drawn by Sir William Johnson, who was the chief Indian Affairs agent at the time. And this reflects the Fort Stanwix Treaty, where everything south of Ohio was relinquished. And here's another drawing with some familiar, we've got Long Island of the Holston and some of the familiar landmarks there showing the Lochaber Treaty line. And again, just a visual from a different perspective. The green line is the 1763 proclamation. Then you got the Treaty of Hard Labor with the dotted line and Fort Stanwix boundary, which again is the Ohio River. So at this point, I like to ask the audience, are you confused about where the treaties were and who could live where? Because you should be, because it was very confusing. Now, how did you purchase land at that time if you were a Virginian? So there's four ways really to acquire land. You can buy existing deeded, patented land from another individual, which would be much like buying property from someone today. You may have a treasury warrant that you purchase, and that's where the government has land available to parcel out and sell. And you're purchasing it with a warrant from the government or from the colony of Virginia in this case. Then you have military warrants. And the early settlement in Kentucky was all about military warrants because during the French and Indian War, a lot of the officers and enlisted men that served in the armies did not get paid. They received a warrant once they filed for it, which gave them certain X number of acres of land. It varied based on rank and length of service. So a colonel might get 1,000 acres, a private maybe 50 or 100 acres with rights to buy additional acreage. So the final method of obtaining land is simply move there, build a cabin, grow corn, and when the time comes, say preemption rights. I've been here, I've lived here, and this is my land. And often that worked out. And I'm going to pass around some examples so you can see up closer what these warrants look like. Another interesting find on the internet, which I was surprised to stumble across it, is Thomas Bullitt ran a newspaper ad in the Virginia Gazette for this expedition. It was published on December 3rd, 1772. He said, I hereby give notice I shall attend with Mr. Douglas and other such assistant surveyors, as it may be thought necessary to appoint by the 15th of April on the Ohio, opposite the mouth of the Scioto River, in order to survey the lands claimed under His Majesty's proclamation, also any other claims that I may be directed to survey. Therefore, recommend it to the officers and soldiers that do not personally attend their surveys to appoint agents to see it done and receive their lands. Thomas Bullitt, surveyor. So what he's doing there is trying to get more military warrants sent to him so he can survey more land, charge fees for it, and make it a more successful financial endeavor in the whole expedition. We don't have a complete list. We know there's about 40 men on that expedition, so it's quite an undertaking. It started around the end of May and didn't finish till mid-October. So you got a better part of 5 months of time in the field on this expedition. So it was logistically quite an undertaking. They were going to be 600 miles away from the nearest settlement. So think of the food supplies you need for 5 months for that many men and the tonnage of equipment, powder, lead, everything else. They weren't going to get resupplied, or at least I can't find any evidence that they did while they were on the expedition. There's a number of names here that you recognize that later became well-known men in the Kentucky frontier. Certainly James Harrod built Harrodsburg, and my neighborhood is on Harrods Creek that he named for himself on this expedition. James Sandusky, Hancock Taylor was a very important man on the frontier, and I believe he was killed in the Battle of Blue Licks. Matthew Bracken County, you've probably heard of. Jacob Drennan. The McAfees, there was 3 McAfee brothers, James, Robert, and George, that certainly made a name for themselves on the frontier. And Robert McAfee is buried not far from here in St. Matthews, in a little cemetery in the neighborhood across from the park and Baptist Hospital. Not that hard to find. Let's talk a little bit about Thomas Bullitt now. So who was this man leading such a daring and difficult and challenging expedition? Certainly he had to have a lot of grit and leadership skills to take up something like this or to hire a man to do this. He was born in Prince William County in 1730. 1754 was made captain in the county militia. He served with Washington at the Battle of Great Meadows and at Braddock's defeat or Braddock's expedition. Battle of Monongahela, 1755. Hero at Grant's defeat, Battle of Fort Duquesne in 1758. 1763, Adjutant General of State Militia. 66, built an inn at Hot Springs in Bath County, Virginia on his 300-acre tract there. That's currently still there as a hot springs resort, and it's the Omni Homestead Resort. He originally built it with about 30 rooms, which was a huge building for that time. 1775, contributed to the Battle of Great Bridge, which drove the British permanently from Virginia. He was promoted to colonel for that action. Was elected several times House of Delegates, newly formed Virginia government during the war. Then died in his home in Fauquier County, Virginia in 1778 at the age of 48. He wasn't killed in any action. He died of natural causes and left his estate to his brother, Cuthbert Bullitt. His nephew, Alexander Scott Bullitt, settled in Kentucky in 1783. Bullitt County here is actually named after Alexander Scott Bullitt, not Thomas Bullitt. So let's start the journey here. So what I did with the various journals I had, some of them covered the same dates, some were different. I combined them together to try to put the story together to see in their own words what this expedition entailed and what it was like. So May 11th, in Fort Pitt, George Cron, and George Cron was the uncle of William Cron that built Locust Grove. He wrote in a letter to Thomas Wharton, Captain Bullitt is now here with instructions to secure lands on the Ohio and make returns to Virginia. So there's a clear documentation that exists of when this expedition kicked off. Sometime in late May, Bullitt and the main contingent of men departed from Fort Pitt with a boat, later identified by McAfee as a bateau. A bateau is a wooden rowboat. It could be anywhere from 20 to 40 foot in length. The size we don't know, but they probably had a good size one for a river like the Ohio, and the amount of supplies they were going to have to take for this long expedition, and the number of men they had to support. They also had 2 canoes at that time for men, and at the mouth, heading to the mouth of the Kanawha River. Kanawha River is in West Virginia. Pennsylvania, dumps into the Ohio. May 10th, the three McAfee brothers assembled at the home of James McAfee on Catawba Creek in Virginia, say goodbye to family to begin their journey to join Bullitt. So they must have corresponded previously with Bullitt that they were going to be joining the expedition. The group traveled overland from Draper's Meadow and built canoes, which would have been dugouts, by all probability, on the Kanawha River at present-day Charleston, West Virginia. After about a week, which is amazing to build canoes that quick for a dugout, they set out for the Ohio River. On the 29th of May, McAfee joined Bullitt at the mouth of Kanawha, and the combined group continued down the Ohio with 4 canoes and 1 boat. They were accompanied by 5 Delaware Indians with families going down to the falls, which is here, to hunt. I do expeditions in the 18th century, so it's not all lectures and fort events. Sometimes I do some rather ambitious ones. The longest one I ever did was 100 miles in 4 days in the most difficult terrain we could select. But this gives you an idea of some of my canoe expeditions, and it's very representative. It's on some of the same waterways that they traveled on. We're dressed exactly the same, carrying the same supplies. So this gives you a good representation of what this expedition would have looked like going down the Ohio. So now we roll into June. On June 1st, the group left Bullitt while he traveled overland to Chillicothe in Ohio, which was the main Shawnee village at the time, to meet with the Shawnee, where he arrived on June 5th. He traveled with 3 of his men and 3 Delaware Indians. And a visual of that would be here. That would be Bullitt with his 3 men and with a Delaware guide heading overland to Chillicothe. So they walked into the Shawnee village undetected, which created quite an uproar, actually, because they weren't used to white men just walking in the village without expecting them. And they threw them in wigwams or structures for about 3 days to decide what to do with them. Since he was an agent of Lord Dunmore, he was there in official capacity, so they gave him counsel and heard him out. He actually documented his whole speech to them. It's kind of interesting, very wordy. And they did their speech, and then they sent him on his way. And they basically apparently gave him some additional supplies and some additional canoes. And I assume his Delaware guides continued to remain with him. So the rest of the company that didn't travel overland traveled another 20 miles, camped, hunted, and scouted the land. After those negotiations were successful and completed, as I said, Bullitt acquired 2 canoes and descended to Skilda to catch up with the rest of the party, but they weren't there yet. On June 7th, the main party came to Large Creek, hunted about 12 miles up that waterway, noting the fine lands. On June 11th, the main party arrived at the mouth of Skilda to wait for Bullitt. They noted 2 old Indian towns on both sides of the river. The group was accompanied by 9 canoes of Delaware Indians. That's a lot of Indians. Because these aren't small 16-foot canoes like you see out on waterways today. These would have been probably 30-foot canoes. So it could have been a pretty large force. I'm sure that made them uncomfortable. But Bullitt arrived on the 13th with some good news. He's accompanied by Richard Butler, who was a trader from Fort Pitt and was his translator when he was in the Chillicothe in the village. Without that, the events could have been disastrous. So again, this is Bullitt and his men heading overland with their Indian guide. I think that's Highway 35 or 53. You might have it transposed that runs from the Ohio River up to Chillicothe now. It's probably on the same route that they took. So a second ill-fated expedition attempted that same year. In June, another party under William Thompson in Pennsylvania landed at Skilda to meet with Bullitt, but he missed him. He was there to survey lands for military warrants, just like Bullitt was, but for Pennsylvania veterans, not for Virginia veterans. Remember, back on the charter, Virginia had, under English law, claim to Kentucky lands. Pennsylvania did not. So he hoped that he could conduct his surveying and then give all his surveying notes to Bullitt. And since he's a licensed surveyor, or was authorized by Lord Dunmore to do the survey, that he would be able to get them entered for him. So it was a big gamble he took. He had over 60 men, and they went down the river on flatboats and sent their horses over land. Some of Thompson's men did encounter some members of Bullitt's party, but Thompson and Bullitt never connected that whole summer, surveying up and down the Ohio and the tributaries to it. His horse contingent was attacked by Indians and the horses were never delivered, and he lost supplies as a result as well. His company split up and surveyed many of the streams and rivers on the Ohio, and particularly up the Licking River, which is where Covington is today. He later submitted surveys to William Preston, who was the county surveyor of Fincastle County, Virginia, and he was basically the official in charge of entering surveys for any Western lands. But they were all denied on the grounds that they were made illegally. Pennsylvania's had another attempt to have them recognized in 1783, but no land titles were ever issued as a result of the Thompson surveys. So probably 4 or 5 months of work for nothing. Another picture just giving an idea how the travel would have looked in the canoes that they would have used at the time. So back to Bullitt and his party. June 17th, they went, and some of this I'm just giving you their exact wording so you can just see what their entries were like and how they recorded their journals. Went down river 10 miles, finding a creek with salt pond, noting good deal of fine land, limestone water. And these men weren't just laying out and measuring the land for submitting the surveys. As part of that process, they noted the water quality, the game, the types of trees, the quality of the soil. They often made very detailed notes of the land that you were getting and what the quality of that was. After several days, they moved camp 16 miles downriver. They found some very fine land along the river for corn, hemp, tobacco, and anything the man can put in the ground. There's another saying that the soil in Kentucky, a man can raise 4 times the crops or double the crops that he can in Virginia. So the soil here was very good for farming. McGaffey walked 30 miles up and down a creek that they observed, making notes on the waters and the timber again. Captain Bullitt left his bateau there. Mr. Kennedy's surveyor, 12 men, laid off a town of 100 acres on the river. We can't determine what that town was or ever succeeded. June 24th, McGaffey left the river, following the creek 10 miles, came to another river and followed that for 25 miles. Went over a ridge, found a good deal of good wheat land. Came back to the Ohio River to look for his canoe, and it was gone. So he had to make a bark canoe, which is, again, the photo I showed you previously was some of my men out in a bark canoe. And went down the river and found the company on the 27th at the mouth of the Licking River, which again would be Cincinnati and Covington area. It's interesting that you have a white man making a bark canoe. That's generally a native skill. It takes a lot of knowledge and experience to know how to build one properly. So what he did was probably a very rudimentary thing to just get him down the river to catch up with the rest of the crew, since his original canoe was stolen or borrowed, maybe. We don't know. June 25th, the main party sailed 30 miles to the Little Miami and Licking River, which is currently, again, Cincinnati, Ohio. On the 26th, McGaffey left Mr. Douglas, who was a licensed surveyor, and part of the company surveyed 7,000 acres up the Licking River. On the 30th, they went to the Big Miami River, lots of lowlands where the Peaks live, an Indian nation. It's an interesting entry because I can't find anybody that can identify who the Peaks were. That's an unrecognized, unrecorded Native American tribe, but that's what they referred to them as. So maybe they got the name wrong, or they were just some branch of the Shawnee, but if anybody has ever heard of them or knows a reference, I'd be interested. Get that out of the way. So this shows you some of the equipment they would have used. Actually, in this closest to me here, both these compasses are original, 18th century. The one is a wood compass, the other is brass. The brass one dates probably about 1750. But the wood compass is on a Jacob staff. It would have been hard in the woods in the terrain they were in using a tripod, so they probably used the Jacob staff for most of their surveying, which gives you a little less accuracy in maintaining a level compass. July 1773 to the Kentucky River and Falls, Ohio. On the 2nd, they went downriver 25 miles. Lands on both sides flat and rich, but not much water. On the 4th came to Big Bone, where Captain Bullitt intended to make station and survey land. They notated it's a wonder to see the large bones that lie there, which have been several large, big creatures. They're saying it was about 200 yards long and as wide. The waters are muddy and have a smell of sulfur. Is everyone familiar with Big Bone Lick Park? Not that far up the river from here. So when they arrived, you had mastodon or mammoth bones littering the whole area, the whole licking area for, that had been there for 12,000 years. Because I believe, anyone wants to correct me, they can, but I believe that's when they became extinct in the area. So for 12,000 years, they managed to continue to have a large deposit of these bones, and they were very fascinated with that. They thought that they were the bones of elephants. July 7th, there came a trading canoe, which told them above the Kanawha, they came upon a man lying on the edge of the water, appeared to be killed by Indians. McAfee party left Captain Bullitt and went 25 miles downriver till 8 o'clock at night and put ashore and lay in our canoes all night. They did that to be ready to move if they had to. They were obviously scared by the news. July 8th, they left an hour before day with Mr. Taylor. That'd be Hancock Taylor and 8 men, got to the mouth of Kentucky or Lavisa and went about 18 miles upriver to the mouth of the creek that came towards Big Bone. Came from towards Big Bone. So that I think is Eagle Creek when you go up the Kentucky River off the Ohio. I've tried to find the big salt lick that they found there, but I've been searching. I don't know exactly where that is. It's just probably not a salt lick anymore. It's been drained. July 8th, left an hour before, I'm sorry, I already read that. July 9th, went upriver 5 miles to the mouth of a creek in Sandbar, up the creek 1 mile. This is the salt lick I was talking about. 1 mile in length, 100 yards wide. Salt licks, they were fascinated, they valued because it attracted herds of animals. So it made hunting really easy if you hung out in those areas. There'd always be a lot of game. They laid there from Friday the 9th to Wednesday the 14th. The survey tracks the land there. So again, that's just upriver from here. Another example of travel by birch bark canoe or wood bark canoe. July, the surveying is well underway. 10th to 14th, they lay there until some land was surveyed. Bullitt arrives with a large party of Delaware Indians who are returning from a long hunt. A long hunt just means references in duration. You're going off for a long period of time to dry a lot of meat and procure a lot of hides. Bullitt placated them as he did with the Shawnee and a promise not to molest him. He left for the falls, and the McAfees continued along the Kentucky River and its tributaries looking for choice land. So basically, Bullitt wants to come down to the Falls, Ohio, which is where we're at today, and sent one of his contingent of men and surveyors up the Kentucky River. 15th, McAfee found a small buffalo path, which is about 50 and 100 yards wide and 30 miles across that's extended for 30 miles across low flat ridges with middling timber and land, but no water. The buffalo traces were very large. Sometimes it would take, if you got held up by the buffalo coming through back then, they said it could take an hour for all the buffalo to pass. Just thousands and thousands. And the trace itself, not a narrow trail, it could be 100, 200 yards wide. And these game trails are probably thousands of years old. It's been used by animals to get across all the easy passes in the mountains and fords of the river, low spots, and so forth. July 16th, came to Sam River, Kentucky, and crossed it. 17th, set off for Lavisa. I think the Lavisa, there really is another name for the Big Sandy. Left an axe, tomahawk, fishing gig in the spring at McAfee Spring. That spring is on private property, about 10 miles north of Harrodsburg, Kentucky right now. So that Robert McAfee had some land there. So I don't know if the tomahawk and axe are still there, but I'd like to check it out sometime and see. But I do know where the spring is. July 23rd, made 3 surveys in Crooked Creek, which is referring to Salt River. It's what they called it originally. It was Crooked Creek. Above James McCoon Jr. for Samuel Adams, 3 more for George McAfee. Above that, 3 more for James McCoon Sr. Also made 2 surveys for myself, 400 acres each. So you can see that they're expecting to make money off this expedition. The reason they took this risk wasn't for the terrible pay, if they ever were going to get paid. It was to acquire land for themselves. And they had the opportunity not just to acquire land for themselves, but to pick out the best and choice land, much of which they expected to later sell and make a profit. 25th, Isaac Height and company floated all night, arrived at Harrods Creek. That's here in Prospect. 29th, made 4 surveys, 400 acres each. 30th, made 2 surveys, 400. So you see they're doing hundreds of thousands of acres a day. So they're moving fast. The 31st, per Height, went to camp, hard rain. That's his spelling, not mine. First laid at camp, second went to falls and camp, third went out to kill meat, fourth made 2 400-acre surveys. So they're really focused on hunting and surveying. Now, some of the challenges, this is one of my expeditions on North Fork of the Kentucky River, is not having a good place to camp. So here we had nothing but mud and steep hills for miles and miles. It was getting late. So we formed a human chain and we passed all the supplies up so you didn't have to run up and down the hill, wear yourself out. You're only using upper body doing this, so less work. And then we even passed the canoes up doing that. So again, another picture of a human chain and unloading supplies. And these survey expedition, as long as they were moving, they didn't lay up for camp for 3 or 4 days. They were doing this every day. And in the morning, you have to reverse it all. Here's the camp you can build with a canoe. You just turn it over and you run an oil tarp off of it. And that was a common practice at the time. The voyagers and the natives did the same thing, often sleeping under them to protect you from the weather. So back to the notes and entries. On July 31st, McGaffey party set off up the Kentucky River for home after surveying their personal claims on Crooked Creek, again, Salt River. This return trip was done on foot, traveling 20 to 30 miles a day. That's an impressive pace on no trails and just bushwhacking it through the woods of Kentucky. I've done that. I don't like to do that much each day. It's a challenge. And I've done it in 18th century attire and moccasins. August 6th, rained some all day, came up the river 20 miles through some very bad ground. We had a hard time getting along, had the river to raft across, so they couldn't find a ford. Then they came about 25 miles. Again, impressive for fording rivers and everything else. So the Bullitt, just to bring you back, the Bullitt expedition has split off now. One group is heading back on foot over land to go over the mountains back to Virginia. The others are still surveying. And Bullitt is among the contingents that's still in the Louisville area surveying. This gives you an idea of what some of the Shawnee warriors would have looked like. In this case, they're not dressed out as warriors, they're just hunting. But a very good representation. So we get into August 5th to the 9th. Height and Douglas went to survey for Bullitt from the falls downriver. That meant they went past Louisville and they're heading further down the Ohio River at this point to see what's down there after the falls. And Bullitt and his crew continued to survey on this side of the river, and they would have been surveying the St. Matthews area. Most of downtown Louisville was not very habitable at the time. The whole Stanford Field area would have been wetlands, so they would have avoided that. They would have gone up into the highlands and up to Beargrass Creek drainage area, St. Matthews, and further out into the county area to find good lands. August 17th, well, I'm sorry, I skipped one there. August 13th, Height rendered at camp, plotted and rode all day. So finally, they're making some documentation that there's a lot of paperwork to do because you can't survey if you don't keep notes of what you did and drawings and so forth. So they're, with all their supplies and all the rain and the weather and conditions, they had to maintain journals and booklets and keep all that stuff dry with the materials they had at the time. Hard rain, gale all night, wet in canoe, lost most of our powder. 15th, dried our things. So it took 2 days to dry things out, basically, or wait for the rain to fall or end. And followed the meanders of the river, surveying 3,000 acre tracts. Those are, or I'm sorry, three 2,000 acre tracts, big tracts at that point. August, so a 2,000 acre tract would be more like a colonel on a military warrant, what they would have received. Went up Salt River about 20 miles, unloaded our canoes and killed 3 elks. That's a lot of meat. 18th, went up to Salt Lick, stayed 19th and 20th. Bullitt's Lick is what they're referring to there, which is currently Shepherdsville, Kentucky. There's a huge spring. It still flows very heavily, but it's capped off and it's part of the city water supply today. But at that time, it was a huge salt lick. Again, the minerals would spill out of the water under the ground and attracted the herds of animal. And the other value the licks had to them was the salt itself. They would set up big, large cauldrons or pots and boil the water down to get salt to preserve their meat and for flavoring. August 23rd, went out with Mr. Douglas to survey and to look for some land for him. So again, they're taking care of themselves on this expedition. Killed a deer and buffalo, went down to the mouth of Salt River. So they're starting to head back up to rejoin Bullitt. This contingent is to rejoin Bullitt at the Falls of Ohio. 26 overtook the canoes at the falls. So they said, see you guys, we're heading home. Went through the falls to the first island, which would be, which island? 6 Mile. Saturday 28th went up to the island above Harrods Creek. So we know that's the next one. Is that 14? Yeah. Yeah, it's just right up there above captain's quarters on the island there. So a lot of familiar names. You see a lot of the names of roads and the areas of town and so forth, either bear Indian names that held over or names that the frontiersmen or these early surveyors applied for themselves. 29th, Mr. Cowan went up and ran the line between Captain Bullitt and Mr. Douglas. Philip Cooper got bit by a snake. You always wonder that had to be a problem for him. Actually, it was a big problem. And on the famous Mason-Dixon survey, one season, they were surveying in the winter and then into the spring. And then they actually stopped surveying when they said the rattlesnakes were coming out of their dens. So how'd they treat it? Well, of course, bear oil and salt. That works, right? I don't know if that provided any comfort, but it certainly probably didn't help it with the bite any. This gives you a little idea of what a loaded canoe looks like. They would have used oilcloth and just had sheets of it and rode up their supplies in it and tied it off with rope. August 30th, started to Kentucky River, went about 20-25 miles. 31st got to Kentucky at dark. So this is, remember, the one party had already gone back over the mountains. So this is the other party coming up the river and just paddling upstream against the current. Went with Samuel Hinch and killed a very fat buffalo. That night, there came 3 Indians to us. On the 2nd, Captain Bullitt and his company led us and went to Kentucky and hid the things that we intend to leave there. So they were storing gear so they don't have to bring it back next season. They expect it to return is what that tells you. We saw earlier where they were hiding some instruments in a spring. So that made sense. If you got axes and heavy equipment with you that you can stash, and then it's less you have to drag with you next time. 3rd, they went a piece further and hid the things, went a piece further, convenient place to run her up to dry, left our kegs of meat and tallow and flour in the canoe. So that tells you that some of what they're storing method is the kegs, wooden kegs for dried foods and so forth. I'm kind of impressed that this late in expedition, they still had flour and haven't run out, which makes me wonder if they didn't get resupplied by Indians but I know there'd be no white men providing resupply to them as far as they were. September 4th, sailed up for lands. They're going to survey, went about 6 miles, killed a buffalo for our suppers and breakfast and killed a calf, skinned it and cooked it. An interesting how I spelled cook there. Again, that's their spelling, not mine. But you see kind of the routine of their entries now, what their day looked like: hunt, eat, move, survey, just repetitive pattern here. September 6th, ran a surveying line, found a buck and skinned him, killed a buffalo, 2 calves. On the 8th, finished and went to the canoe. The Indians had taken our flour and corn and all our oars, except setting poles of 1 each for each canoe. Setting pole is just a long pole to press yourself off the bottom near the edge of the water. So you could navigate with that, but probably not as well as with paddles. On the 14th, came to the mouth of Big Mammy, where there were 4 Indians and their families. Stayed to about 1 o'clock, rendering tallow. Tallow is just animal fat. They cook down, and then they would have used that probably for food preparation and seasoning. May have also used it to waterproof things, not really sure. But obviously, they always take time to make use of the fat and bear oil, and they don't waste it. 22nd, they found Captain Thompson's directions on a large beach. So remember the Thompson party from Pennsylvania, which was working in the same areas that same summer of 73, to no avail because Virginia would never accept their survey entries. But they found sign of the party. I guess left a message in the sand. John Hamilton killed 3 buffaloes, went out in the evening to fetch meat for 4 miles. So they are taking a shot from a canoe. That's Steve Cottle, who portrays Daniel Boone professionally. He does a very good job as him. Bullitt party returns to the settlement. So now we're getting into near the end of the expedition. September 26th, went 8 to 10 miles, killed 3 buffaloes on the creek, went after the buffaloes and saw a leopard. I thought it was interesting that they didn't say a puma or a mountain lion or cougar, referred to it as leopard. Went back to the cabin lots. 27th stayed that day and settled with Captain Bullitt and barbecued our meat. I think they're probably referencing, it's the only time I've ever seen the term barbecue used in the 18th century. So they're probably referencing how they cooked it. I don't think they had a big thing, a gallon of barbecue sauce, which is what I would have used. September 28th started about 10 o'clock and came about 18 miles and camped. 29th went on and 20 miles and rained all day. So even in the rain, they're traveling 20, 30 miles a day. October 1st went within 10 miles of Big Sandy. 3rd, walked a piece on shore and found a cabin where they got 2 pumpkins, which made us a fine supper with a turkey about 8 miles above the Wyandotte. October 6th and 10th, continued traveling upriver, passing several islands and sandbars. There's a lot of them the further you get up the Ohio toward Pittsburgh. Hunting fish, catching 3 fine catfish at a sycamore. I thought that was interesting because that's the first only reference of all these journals they make to fishing. I think that what it was is they preferred meat over catfish and what came out of the river, and the meat was so plentiful available. Hunting was very, very easy. October 16th, went up Fish Creek 12 miles to the Wallaces. There they saw Messrs. Clark and Higgins. I don't know if that's George Rodgers Clark, but it could be. On Sunday, 17th, stayed there. The 19th, Jimmy Sandusky left us, and we got about 3 miles above Wheeling. On the 21st, they met Colonel Stevens, got to Mr. Munchmore's on the 22nd. That must have been something. So here they are at the end of the expedition, unloading their remaining supplies. This was the end of a 4-day expedition I did. So what's the impact and key observations of this expedition? It was the start of aggressive efforts to survey and settle Kentucky. It was a contributing factor to Lord Dunmore's war. The Indians, the Shawnee particularly, did not like the fact that they were surveying and planning on settlement in the Kentucky lands. The physical challenges are enormous. Boat and canoe travel 20 to 40 miles a day, foot travel 20 to 30 miles a day, continued exposure to elements, loss or exhaustion of provisions, snake bite, Indian aggression, all concerns. Frequent presence and interaction with the Indians. As you saw in those entries, they must have been around them most all the time. Large parties at that. So the Ohio River in those days would have been a busy place. A lot of canoes going up and down. And there's no mention of any dogs present, whereas long hunters coming through the Cumberland Gap on horseback always have dogs with them. They played an important role. So I don't know if it's because the canoe travel and the dogs don't do well in that situation, or why these men would have definitely owned dogs. But there's no reference at all to having anything with them. So I'm assuming they did not. Little mention of fishing. Again, game would have been very easily available. These men were very proficient with canoe use and building them. They frequently make reference for camping for days, but no details on what or how they built the shelters. I just have an idea of that from other references outside of this survey. Land claims was the primary reward. Only 2 surveys were injured as a result of this expedition. So what happened when they get back to Colonel Preston, as you see here, in his nice and warm cabin back in Fincastle County, Virginia, he informs Thomas Bullitt, oh, after 5 months of hard work and risk you took and the expense, I can't enter these surveys. They're not legal. In his opinion, they were over the Indian treaty line. That land was not clear for survey. And then he informed Bullitt, he says, and you're not officially licensed under my county as a surveyor. So he basically rejected it after all that work. So obviously he was very pissed about that. And he went to the colonial governor, who authorized the whole expedition to begin with, and complained. And Lord Dunmore corresponded with Preston. Preston must have been on strong legal ground or been a very powerful individual, because he stood up to colonial general and colonial governor and said, no, we're not entering these surveys. They're not legal. But he did enter 2 for best friends of Lord Dunmore, I guess, just to appease him. And those were just kind of down the river a little bit from here. That's where those surveys were, but they can be identified, but I don't recall the names they were put under originally. So that concludes it. As shared during the introduction, I run a reenacting group called Fincastle County Surveyors. We're always recruiting surveyors, chainmen, hunters, scouts. So if anyone is up for adventure or just doing some of the educational stuff at Locust Grove and Fort events and so forth, I do have over on the other table here with the blue tablecloth some membership forms if you're interested. There's no fee at this time to join our group, and we're always interested in bringing on some fresh blood, new talent. Okay.
We have time for questions. And Scott, would you like people to use the mics? Yeah, if you don't mind, please come up and use the mic. That way the people in the chat rooms can hear you as well.
Yeah, the one question I have is, what's the focal point? You're measuring, but from what? And so how do I know where that piece of land is?
Great question. So they would pick typically a geographic mark or something easily identifiable. Could be a big rock monument. It could be where Harrods Creek dumps into the Ohio River, or where Beargrass Creek dumps into the Ohio River. And they said the good land is up this way from this water drainage here. And that'd be a point of reference. So they'd start there and they'd document that. The other way to do it is to use a sextant and 18th century navigational methods to try to determine where the heck you are. But I'd say on an expedition like this, they were probably using, if they even had a sextant with them, they were probably just using natural features as a starting point. And then once you mark, they did not, for monuments or the corners of the property they're surveying, they brought stakes to mark it while they're doing the work. But once they hit a corner where they're going to make a turn or the end of a survey, they would then blaze trees, and they had tools for doing that. So they'd mark the trees, whose property it is, put the acreage or the measurements and so forth on that. And then that became an anchor for the next survey going any direction from there.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for your presentation. I'm from Owensboro, retired attorney. We did a lot of real estate work there. A lot of descriptions from the old oak tree to the river. How accurate were your all surveys compared to current standards? I mean, you all were in rough ground. You didn't have adjoining neighbors. I guess you had to worry about crossing property lines too much. But how accurate would you say those surveys were compared to today's?
Another good question. They were very accurate when they wanted them to be, but the next year in 1774, keep in mind, the survey work they did here was not registered or entered into the books. So it was dead at that point. So the next year, in his frustration, Lord Dunmore sent John Floyd, who was a very close friend and lived on the Colonel Preston's estate, to come redo this work over again. Floyd surveyed the St. Matthews area for himself, 2,000 acres, but he really surveyed 2,600 acres. So he's filing 2,000, he's taking 2,600. So it's not accurate, but that has to be by intention, not by error. So a little side note, he was killed by the Shawnee in 1783 out by Shepherdsville, Floyd was. And Alexander Breckenridge was his best friend who married his wife a year later. And he renamed the survey line Breckenridge Lane. So it's stuck to this day. That's why it's a straight road. It's a survey boundary. So the remnants of what they did here is all over the place. Yes.
Yeah, thanks also for the great presentation. From the start, I guess I was sort of scratching my head because, I've read about the 1763 proclamation line, and this is 1773 before the revolution. So and you sort of touched on that at the end when they went back to try to register it, but I guess just the legality of the thing in terms of, I thought the proclamation line said no settlement on the other side of it.
Yeah, it
But-
did.
but-
It
but-
said that, and it also said that no individual can purchase Indian land other than the crown, and it will never be taken militarily. So he was treating his Indian subjects, his sovereignty seriously. The king was in the parliament. So they said only the crown can purchase land from the natives, not an individual, no land company, because there was a lot of land companies forming at the time to try to, because it obviously didn't, if you're a wealthy colonist, you buy enough trade goods and throw some cash on the table. It didn't take much for the Indians to sell large quantities of land. Question is whether it was theirs to sell. Yeah,
Okay. Oh,
did I not answer?
well, yeah, I mean, so but was this the Crown selling I mean,
So the Crown's intention was for further western expansion to purchase, not take land from the natives. And it gradually over time. So that would have been a gradual, slow process. And it would involve more assimilation with the native
so
population.
because
But the colonists, like Lord or colonial governor, was stretching it and may have been
Okay.
breaking the law depending on which treaty you want to look at. So Fort Stanwix's treaty was negotiated by Sir William Johnson, who was the lead Indian agent for the British government. So you could say they sold the Iroquois Federation that had dominion over the Kentucky lands, sold it all.
Okay.
And agreed to relinquish it under the Fort Stanwix Treaty, negotiated by an official of the British government.
Okay.
So it depends on how you want to interpret the legalities. I'm sure it would create a lot of lawsuits today.
Yeah, okay, so those treaties you're saying were extensions of the proclamation line,
Yes,
In theory.
negotiated, at
In
times
theory.
negotiated by
which,
British agents, other times like Colonel, what's his name? Not Preston, but the other one that did Sycamore shows. He got the Cherokee to sell Kentucky, and they clearly didn't have any claim to Kentucky.
Okay.
But they were glad to sell it.
Any other questions? What happened after Preston turned Bullitt down? Did Bullitt come back and do a new series of surveys?
No, the only time Thomas Bullitt ever came to Kentucky was on this expedition. So again, Alexander Scott Bullitt, his nephew, settled at Oxmoor, I think, and he Bullitt County is actually named after him. The nephew became a very prominent man in Kentucky later years. But no, Bullitt never made it back. He died during the American Revolution and never saw Kentucky again. I don't know how he handled. I'd love to find reference as to who paid for this expedition. Did Lord Dunmore, or did Bullitt do it on credit? And was he in debt for it? But it financially well off enough back in Virginia to weather that? It's there. I can't find any documentation to tell me that who paid for it, because whoever paid for it is going to be the one that's upset. Plus the men who on the survey surveyed a lot of acreage for themselves and did a lot of sweat equity for those surveys and didn't get to keep that land.
Well, and then lastly, a lot of these surveys, a lot of the land grants were given for service in the Revolutionary Army.
After the war.
And so were those grants based on these surveys taken before the Revolutionary War?
No, the surveys before the Revolutionary War were military warrants for service during the French and Indian War.
Yeah.
After the American Revolution, same thing, the government was broke, kind of like today. And they decided that they just paid the soldiers with warrants. So they had Kentucky freeing up still during that time. It was during the heyday of migration into Kentucky. And they were able to satisfy a lot of those warrants. The problem is you had a lot of preemption. You had a lot of people just coming here on their own, building a farm, a cabin and corn. And in the courts, it became such, there was a lot of pancaking of claims overlapping each other, from official surveys, then people just settling on it, other surveyors ignoring the tree blazes and resurveying the same land. The pancaking became a serious problem, and is creating a lot of problems, including violence in Kentucky over land matters. So they created land commissioners out of Virginia, which went around to all these frontier courts and basically heard these cases, and the land commissioners ruled on them or took the cases to a court. But as other attorneys have told me that deal with real estate matters, that some of the problems created then still exist today. Because the boundaries, I'm studying a whole book of surveys for Simon Kenton right now, and almost every boundary is a tree. Occasionally you get a creek, something a little more permanent, but those trees are long gone. And they're often sycamore trees because they're big.
Or hackberries.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dennis, so much. This was great.
Thank you.